I can get your attention, we'd like to begin. Hello, good afternoon to everyone. I'd like to welcome you here to our third lecture in our lecture series. And before I introduce the next person, I first would like to thank our sponsors who have worked with us in our celebration of 150 years of our history. First, I'd like to thank Purple, Sorensen, Philip Graham, GIS, ACS, they're providing us our cart services. But also I wanted to thank a specific person within Gallaudet Interpreting Services, and that's Nancy DeWitt. She's the person who's responsible for coordinating all the logistics of the interpreters. As you see, we have a number of participants who are deafblind, requiring deafblind interpreting services. So I want to especially thank Nancy for her coordination efforts and all of the individuals who are here providing support and access so that everyone can be a part of this wonderful presentation, as we'll be hearing in a few moments. In my previous introductions, the last couple of lectures, I've neglected to mention the committee, and I did want to recognize at this point in time Brian Greenwald and his committee. First off, Teresa Burke, Carrie Solomon, Gaurav Mather. These are the individuals who are part of the program committee who have coordinated the lectures that we'll be seeing both today and in the upcoming months. We want to thank everyone who's sponsored and also participated in this event today. And with that, I'd like to introduce Danny, and I'm referring to him as Danny. We come from the same home state of Louisiana. But I'd like to introduce Danny Araby.
Thank you, MJ, for turning the floor over to me. Again, I'm Dan, and I'm thrilled to share with you the fact that my friend Bapin is here. He was born far from here near Calcutta, India, in a town called Tavali, a very small village. He was born deaf. His parents were hearing. And in his village, they had an 85% poverty rate. Many of the villagers were unable to read and write. Bapin lost the sight in both of his eyes when he was a young child. His parents persevered and tried to find different educational options for him, finally enrolling him at the Perkins School, which is located near Boston, Massachusetts. He went there in 1983, and upon his graduation, he then entered a university called Gardner-Webb College in North Carolina, and he remained there for 1 year. After that, he transferred to the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, which we abbreviate UALR. He finished his undergraduate studies there, and while there, he was quite active in advising the university about issues of the ADA and so forth. He made an important impact on services for all. He then worked at the Helen Keller National Center, which is in New York State. He is an adaptive technology instructor, and he advises businesses on adaptive technology for deafblind individuals. Today, his focus is going to be on the intersections of technology and its impact on deafblind people. The title of his presentation for us today is "The Power of Technology Leads to Self-Success." Let's please give him a warm Gallaudet welcome to Bapin and Walter.
Thank you, Danny, for that very nice introduction.
You're welcome. Thanks for being here today.
Hello and good afternoon to everyone. My real name is Anindya Bhattacharyya, but I'm much better known to all of you by my nickname, and of course understandably so, seeing how difficult my actual name is to pronounce and to spell. You all know me as Bapin. And you might wonder as to why I've chosen the name that I have and how it relates to me and the way I produce my name in American Sign Language. It actually has to do with my hobby, which is woodworking. And so that is actually the nature of where my sign name came from. But it has nothing to do with the work that I'm doing as it relates to technology. I also wanted to take this opportunity to thank Dan for that very nice welcome that he gave me and wonderful introduction. And also to thank my friend Gaurav, who has invited me here today. It's indeed an honor to be with you. It was about 10 years ago when I got an email on my computer asking if I'd be interested in participating in an opportunity with Gaurav. And so Gaurav came by train to New York, where I was living at the time. And he joined me at my house for a holiday party. After this initial greeting, we became friends and have kept in touch over the years. I also want to thank Brian Greenwald for his continual interactions with me to coordinate all the events to make today possible. As I said, it's indeed an honor to be with you today. I've been to the university a number of times, so this is not my first visit by any means. My first time coming here was back in 1987. And I was about 17 years old at that time. Art Rohrig was an employee here, and I looked to him as a role model. It was during my visit that I had an opportunity to meet with him and talk with him and discuss my plans for education as I moved into my future. He shared with me a number of ideas and bits of advice that I've carried with me through a number of years. There are many people who I remember meeting when I was here and developed friendships with. But all that to say, I'd like to focus now on my presentation today. This material that I'll be sharing with you has been written over time, but I've added information as the time has passed. I actually, interestingly enough, was in the Philippines just a couple of days ago when the super typhoon hit that country, Typhoon Haiyan. I'll allow a moment for the interpretation to Federation of Deaf-Blind Conference that was being held there. It was in Tagaytay, Philippines. Many of you are familiar with the World Federation of the Deaf, and this is a similar organization. It was held in South Africa a couple of years ago. And Dr. Hurwitz was able to attend that particular conference in South Africa. I was very fortunate to be in a location in the Philippines that was not directly impacted by the storm. We were in the southern part of the country, but nonetheless, I was very saddened by the destruction that's been realized there. It's been said that nearly 10,000 people were expected to have died. Fortunately, that number is lower, but nonetheless, it's a great tragedy, and I can't imagine the experience and the life and devastation that people there are experiencing. Individuals were attending this conference from Europe, Asia, Australia, and all of us in attendance remained in the country while the typhoon hit. It would have been on par with a Category 5 hurricane. So there were a number of cyclones that have been experienced by that country, but nothing of this sort. I was fortunate to work alongside of the other conference participants as we stayed together and supported one another. Of course, we were concerned about what was happening, and we wanted to make sure we had adequate preparedness in place. And we came to realize, of course, the significant role that technology played in terms of the communication access it provided us. Being a person who is deaf and blind, I rely heavily on technology. But what's interesting is the hurricane, or the hurricane that hit, was at 4 in the morning. I came into my room. Actually, an individual came into my room, and as you know, that's not standard policy for anyone to enter your room without being escorted in. The person came to me and woke me up to inform me of this terrible storm that was occurring. I was informed that there was some type of an emergency. I got up quickly, got my shoes on, and followed that individual out of the room, where all of us gathered together, all of the Americans that is, and we shared information as to what was happening. I wasn't overly concerned at the time, nor paranoid, but of course others didn't share my sense of calm. Some wanted to go back to the United States, but I was interested in staying and going with the flow, if you will. So after having discussed with a number of people who were participating in the conference, I made a decision not to leave, not to bail out, but rather to stay. Others chose to do differently and left, but again, I wanted to stay. I was able to keep track of the news through the technology, but unfortunately, I didn't watch the news prior to going to bed that evening, and so I wasn't informed as to the impending storm. And I didn't see any news as to what was happening until after the fact. I understand that there were lots of media warnings that were coming through the news lines, and I didn't have access to them because I didn't see the news, but regardless, I wanted to stay and really experience being in a country when this sort of thing is happening. I was able to communicate with my friends and family in India and the States, letting them know that I was all right and that they had no need to be concerned about me. I also kept abreast of weather forecasts through my technology and made sure that I was not in any kind of danger. The weather there was such that there were some winds, not too strong, but there were some winds and some rain. The winds weren't strong enough to blow me all the way back to the States, that's for sure. And I was able to stay in place where I was there in the Philippines at this conference. It was quite an experience that week. It rained for a couple of days straight, and then the rain ceased. And after that, normal activity was regained. You could see that the area around was quite devastated. There was a lot of destruction. Fortunately, my flight was not delayed despite this issue, and I was able to make it back to the States as was originally planned. So I find it very fortunate to have made it through this experience and to return to my home country. Through all of this, though, it's caused me to reflect greatly on the power and impact that technology has on people in the world today, particularly deaf-blind people. If we think back to the days of Helen Keller and think about what was afforded to her in terms of technology, we realize she basically relied on her teacher, Anne Sullivan. Anne Sullivan was greatly noted for being the person who made Helen Keller the success that she was. And much of Helen Keller's success is attributed to Anne Sullivan. She functioned as her teacher, her guide, her reader, and basically did everything that she needed. Clearly, we know times have changed. And I'll allow a moment for the interpreters to resituate and reposition themselves. Again, making some comparisons between when Helen Keller lived and the days we are in now, I think it's pretty evidenced by just looking around us here in the room. We rely on technology in order to be independent, in order to have access to communication that's around us. I mean, think about the iPhones and the different kinds of computers that we all rely so heavily on these days. We no longer have to rely on one single solitary person to provide us that access, but now can engage directly in our world through the use of technology. And with so, we can communicate with everyone on the same level. We can communicate with people halfway around the world, as I have done, and they don't even realize that I'm both deaf and blind, because of the ease that we found through our communication with this technology. I used to use IM to communicate with individuals back in the early 90s. And that was before we had the local communication systems, or global communication systems as we do now. And again, when people came to realize that I was deaf and blind, they were often taken aback because they had no idea as a result of the fact that our communication was taking place through technology. So technology has certainly been a way to break down those barriers between all of us and the world around us. And when I say that technology affords us equal access, what I'm really talking about is the fact that many of us see technology in this way, and yet we recognize there are still technological barriers that exist these days. More and more places are becoming automated. So for example, if you go to an ATM machine, you rely on your sight in order to be able to access the services, or perhaps your ability to hear to access the services of the ATM. But for someone such as myself, I have to memorize exactly what the steps are and try to visualize what they might be. But should anything about that ATM change, I find myself in a bind. So it's devices such as these that cause some issues and barriers. Nowadays as well, there's automated ticketing that you'll find at the Amtrak station. You no longer interface with a human being to purchase your ticket, but rather do so through a piece of technology. So in order for me to be able to swipe my credit card to get my ticket, I often have to rely on someone. Also at the airport, you'll go to a kiosk in order to get your ticket these days, as opposed to interacting with a human. So once again, we see technology being used these days, but sometimes that technology can be a barrier to us. I can use my iPhone now in the airport to check in, and I'm able to get information in regards to my flight, should it be delayed or postponed in any way, through this kind of technology. All this to say, technology is wonderful. And we all know what an iPhone looks like. It looks like a notepad, really. It's actually the size of a notepad. But it has a significant impact on the power it gives us to interact with others. As Dan has mentioned, a little bit of my history, I did want to point out some important milestones. I did grow up in a very small village in India. And back then, there was no electricity, there was no running water, we had no paved roads, There were no vehicles or public transportation. The only thing I saw when I was out walking were cows. That was about it in my hometown. When the monsoons would hit, I can remember walking down the muddy pathways without my shoes, making my way through the mud in order to get from one place to another. My house was made from mud. It was basically a hut. But my parents worked very hard and saved the money that they earned so that we could move from that hut into a nicer home that was made of concrete. When I was 7 years old, we got electricity installed. And that was the first time I was exposed to actually watching television on a black and white television set. It was an amazing thing for me to see a picture actually moving on a screen before my eyes, because I'd not seen anything like that prior to it. And again, looking back to that day and age to where we are now, it almost seems as if it were a joke to think about how wonderful it was to see a black and white television, and now we look at that as being pretty primitive in terms of the way we survived and lived, comparing to what we have these days. But back then we had no access to interpreting services. In fact, there were no services for individuals who were deaf. And I was needing to interact with individuals who were able to hear and who were sighted in order to just interact socially with people. I relied on lip reading. Now, as I mentioned, my parents were educators, and so they worked very hard with me to help me develop my speech reading skills and my ability to lip read. I spoke Bengali, which is the native language, and I was very interested in being educated formally. At the age of 9, I lost my sight, though. And at that time, things changed dramatically for me. I could no longer go to school to be educated. There were no interpreters being provided to me. And with that, there were no support services as well. I was the only person in that school who needed assistance. And I would often be in a classroom in the front row before I lost my sight. And I was able to lip read fairly well until the teacher would turn her back and begin writing on the board, and it was that point in time communication was lost for me. And I had to continually remind the teacher to look directly to me in the class in order to be able to understand what was being said. As I reflect back, I really have to appreciate the advocacy and support that my mother gave me. She always made sure that my needs were met. She reminded the individuals to make sure that they kept their mustache closely cut, that they were clean shaven, because as we know, it's very difficult to read someone with a very bushy mustache. But as I said, this all changed when I became 9 years old. I joined a soccer team at the age of 9, before I lost my sight. I was the only deaf player on the team, and I relied very much on my eyes to be able to play the game, to be able to keep up with the other players. And every now and then I would miss out on something. But despite that, I became very skilled as a soccer player. And because of that, my coach chose me to be an actual player on the team when we played in actual games. One of the other players was quite dismayed at the coach's decision, and as a result got into altercation with me and picked dumps of ashes that had been laying on the ground and threw them at my face. The ashes went into my eyes, it blurred my vision, and I ran to a pond close by to try and wash out the particles of ash in my eye, and from there went straight home, where I shared with my parents what had happened. My father told me that things should be fine, that I should just go to bed and rest, and by the next day my vision should be restored. But the next day when I woke up, everything that I saw had a shade of yellow to it. I couldn't see faces, I couldn't distinguish fine details. And so my parents took me to the local hospital. The doctors tried to save my vision, but realized it was futile because of the retinas in both eyes having become detached. And as you know, there's this critical nerve that ties the vision, the optical nerve, to the brain. It was that very nerve that had been destroyed. I lived for some time with double vision after that. But as time passed, my vision deteriorated to the point that I couldn't see regular-sized print, and I would have to have large print instead. Unfortunately, it was difficult to magnify the print immediately, so whatever print I needed required a couple days in order for it to be magnified so that I could have access to it. But it was within about 3 months then that I lost all of my vision. I sat home for a number of years after that, having nothing to do. And I'll pause here a moment for the interpretation to take place. So again, I sat home for 4 years, really having nothing else to do. And it was about this time that my parents learned about this Perkins School for the Deaf and Blind in Boston, Massachusetts. There was a principal in a local school in Calcutta who shared this information with my parents. So my father sent correspondence to the Perkins School to see if there was any way I would be able to receive a scholarship so that I could attend the school. I was afforded a scholarship to attend, but only for 1 year. So in 1983, my father accompanied me to the Perkins School. So if you can imagine, at this point in time, I didn't know a lick of English. I only knew how to fingerspell a couple of letters of the American Sign Language alphabet. And so my first day of school, all I could say was, "I love you" to everyone, because that's the only sign that I knew. So that's about all I said. That's how I greeted every single person that I met. Well, later that night, I was asked to stay in the dormitory with my father, and my father accompanied me there to function for me as an interpreter, as he interpreted between Bengali and English. But my father was told he had to stay in a different dormitory from me so that I wouldn't be so terribly dependent upon him at all times. Eventually, I learned American Sign Language and English all on my own. But that took some time. So after having arrived, the next day I began studying immediately. I learned Braille, American Sign Language, and English, and I will tell you for one thing, it was extremely challenging. But regardless of the challenge, I was able to persevere. I don't know if you know much about Indian culture, but in Indian culture, we really value close-knit family ties. In fact, the family will typically share one single room. So when we would sleep in the same room as our parents, in separate beds. So I was terrified at being alone in a room without my father. And I told the staff there at the school that I was afraid. But I had a very difficult time communicating that concept with them. So when I told them as best I could that I was afraid, they called my father to come over. And I explained to my father how I was feeling, and my father then shared with the staff my concerns. Well, you can imagine the difficulty it was trying to communicate when we didn't share a common language. But I was very eager to learn, and within 1 year, I picked up the language. My father stayed with me for that first year until I graduated. And I began the process of applying to colleges. During those years, I had no inkling about technology. I lived in a very small village. There was no technology. When I was 14, I first came to try out an Apple IIe with a braille display. Versa Braille, that is. That device weighed 10 pounds, and it was quite heavy, and it had with it a tape store system. And we used it to play trivia. I was an avid reader, and I liked to use technology. And so I was able to access trivia through my new technology. I was eager to learn. And through trial and error was able to really adjust to different kinds of technologies. But this experience really got me interested in learning more about technology. And I was basically hooked from that point forward. I was using a Versa Braille. There was a 3.5-inch floppy disk that was required to be used with this device. And there was a black and white display. But even though that might seem somewhat primitive to you, to me it was quite exciting. I'd go to the different computer shows and look at all the new technology. I'd purchase all kinds of things. In fact, I purchased components to build my own computer, a 40 megabyte computer. And if you can imagine, that doesn't seem like much today, completely obsolete in fact, but back in the day it was pretty impressive. So nowadays it's more like 40 terabytes, but what I built was pretty impressive to me. I used DOS and a variety of other programs, and I used this with my Braille display. I got to the point where I could write computer programs, and that interest has been with me then the rest of my life as I've become very, very interested in different kinds of technology. So after completing my time at the Perkins School, I knew I wanted to go on to college, and I recognized the importance of education in order to be successful in life. And I also wanted to make sure that I could be a role model to other individuals who were deaf and blind, because we're all in this together. And that's one thing that my father always impressed upon me, was the importance of education. And again, that's one of the values of our Indian culture, so that was shared with me and always has stuck with me, that education is the key to success. In 1992, I went on to college. And let me advance the PowerPoint slide now and allow some time for the interpretation to happen.
So the first university I attended was Gardner-Webb, and I stayed there for 1 year. Now, the reason that I left there is that I didn't get my needs met as I thought I could at another location. So I decided to go to the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, and I continued my studies there until I got my bachelor's degree in political science. You might have expected me to get a computer science degree, but no, in fact, I wanted to perhaps work in the legal realm, so I decided to major in political science and eventually go to law school. Of course, that didn't happen. I ended up not going to law school. I went into a completely different direction in pursuing my work with technology. But really, everything that I have learned has been beneficial to me, and I learned it mostly on my own. There was an ADA committee that I was working with, and I gave them advice as to how to make universal accessibility happen for deaf and blind people and others. I recommended that they set up a computer lab with brailing equipment available for students to be able to use in their computer labs. And in fact, that equipment is still there to this very day. And I went back and visited and saw that many improvements have been made since I was a student there. They added ramps, more elevators, and all types of assistive devices for people to make use of. And I was able to then graduate from there in 1993, and I worked at that point as a policy analyst. And I was doing this type of analysis, and at that time I was sending out letters to different agencies and networking across the country. And if you could, go on to the next slide. So I happened to have a friend that worked at the Helen Keller National Center who informed me that there was an open position. And I had not considered applying for this particular position because I did not have a degree in computer science, so I just simply thought that I was not qualified. But I was encouraged to be in touch with the Helen Keller National Center anyway and apply for that job, which I did and was hired in 1999. The first year at the Helen Keller National Center, I realized that they had a very small technology department, and I realized something needed to be done about that. So I recommended to my boss that we needed to expand our programs and the options for students with blindness and deafness to use. So, and also speech techniques for deaf and hard of hearing, all types of disabled equipment needed to be formed. So we worked on this equipment together, and in looking back, I realized that the Helen Keller National Center really was the state-of-the-art institution. It was right there in New York. And in my time there, I've advanced to become a supervisor over the years. I have several staff that work under me in different areas. Some are sighted, some are deaf and blind, some are hearing, some are deaf. It's been a wonderful experience. From the year 2005 to now, I've been doing some other type of work where I've been traveling quite extensively and providing training for people in their homes as well as in different businesses and rehab centers, also training the trainers. So working with different communities on providing accessibility. So we have a national consortium of training programs which sponsor deaf and blind people to be able to receive equipment that will help them meet their needs. Maybe if we could go to the next slide. I had come to Washington, D.C. under the auspices of the Helen Keller National Center several times and met with congressmen and senators, showing them the equipment that we needed to use as deafblind people, the braille machines and the level of expense that they require for deaf and blind people to purchase in order for them to have the accessibility that they need. So I wanted to talk with them about the first steps as to deaf and blind people getting this equipment. Now, in the year 2010, I was working with AADB, and I went with them to go about meeting different senators and representatives, once again emphasizing the importance of technology in the lives of deaf and blind people. So we talked to a Republican senator and talked about the war in Afghanistan. And so they kept spending money on this war, and the service was not being given to us. And we emphasized to them that they needed to spend less money on the war and give more money towards people who need assistance, and that we needed to be a priority as opposed to spending all the money on the war. So as time went on, the FCC actually opened the National Deaf Blind Equipment Distribution Program. This provided equipment for free to deaf and blind people who earn less than a certain income level. So it was great to see this actually happening at this point, and all of these changes happening finally from all these years of lobbying our senators and congressmen. So finally these things are working, and technology is really able to make more of an impact on deaf and blind people. But I know that So I believe we're almost out of time as I look, but I did want to show you this slide. So here you see pictures of the prior dog guide that I had named Dinah. And I now have a new dog that I got last year, and his name is Walter. Also, my wife and my son Navin are pictured here. We live quite a normal life, as any family would. I certainly use my phone to communicate with my wife when I'm working. She and I are able to keep in touch, and both of us take equal responsibility for caring for my son. So we keep each other informed about what our son's doing. I also am able to see my son's face on FaceTime through my iPhone. So I feel it's very important to have that connection with my son. When he's out visiting his grandparents, I'm still able to be in touch with him so that we have a very close bond. So it's very important for us to be able to use video technology in order to be able to communicate. I'm also able to track my son's whereabouts. And as he grows up, I'll be able to know where he is and making sure he's safe. So I'd like to talk, I know I've talked a lot about the use of technology. Let's just move on to another slide here. Related. Another important piece of technology that I make full use of is GPS, Global Positioning Systems. There's a company called the Sendero Group that produces these GPSs, and they use images, basically graphics, that I'm able to make use of. So this group here, the Sendero Group, has adapted this technology so that it can be used in specific places as you're traveling around. Almost like a compass. It uses degrees and coordinates so that you can find your location based on 360 degrees of north, northwest, just like a compass. So let's say I want to go buy a pizza, and I want to go there from my home. What I will do is set the directions within the GPS, point A to point B, and it will be able to lead me right to the pizza shop. It will give me the names of the streets that I'll be passing. And if I get off route, then it will alert me to that fact. And it will recalculate the direction that I need to be moving in. So it's a fabulous technology. Just yesterday, when I was flying in from San Francisco, of course, there's a TV monitor that shows a map where the plane is going as you're flying. And I'm unable to hear the pilot's announcements from the cockpit, of course. So what I am able to do is use my GPS technology to understand where we are en route in the flight. I also know how high we are in the air, 35,000 feet, for example. I knew when we were passing over Denver, and I knew the ETA to our landing. So all of this information is afforded to me from use of this GPS system. So I don't have to sit there not knowing a thing about what's going on in my flight. I'm able to keep well informed as I like to be throughout the flight, which is just wonderful. So I would like to show you more, but I know that our time is running out. But my most important thing to emphasize to you is the fact that phone accessibility has just been the biggest godsend. So for example, let's say I want to go to the bank and deposit money. Now I'm even able to take a photograph of the check and make a deposit directly from my iPhone rather than having to physically go to the bank. So technology is just giving us so many wonderful opportunities. When I take the train every day, if there is a snafu and the train is not running right, I'm able to get updates about that. Also, I know what stop it is making at each point. So technology has just given so much to my life. So I'm just wondering what it's going to be like 20 years from now as technology changes even further. Maybe there'll be robotic interpreters that are just around everywhere, so the human interpreters will be a thing of the past. Maybe we'll have these mechanical interpreters, but you know, interpreters real interpreters will always be better than robotic interpreters because they will provide us full access to our visual environment and also their wonderful personalities. Well, robots would be boring. So we need to keep together, stick together, and keep technology striving ahead. So I want to thank you all very much for your time and attention. And you're paying attention to my talk to you today. Being here at Gallaudet, I know that they are really improving their access services here for deaf and blind students. And I do see bridges being built between the deaf community and the deaf-blind community. We're all a big family. So I would like to applaud Gallaudet for taking the steps that it is taking. And I'm looking forward to seeing more improvements and changes happening as time goes on. And if Gallaudet does not keep up with what they need to be doing, I'll be certain to remind them. Thank you very much.
Wonderful remarks. I'd like to open it up now for questions. Should you have a question, I ask you to come to the front of the room. Please do not cross in front of the televisions, but if you wouldn't mind gathering to the right of the auditorium. I'm Maurice Jr., and your presentation was wonderful. Technology is great, as you've said, but there are still some things that I'm not sure I quite understand. So, for example, you mentioned your use of the iPhone, but the iPhone doesn't have any braille. So how is it you're able to access it when you can't hear on it and it doesn't have braille? So could you explain to me a little bit about how that technology works?
Yes, I can. That's a very good question. So I know that before our time ran out, I was going to try to show you a PowerPoint slide that had the Braille display on it. But perhaps we can go back to that slide since you've asked the question. I have now connected my Focus 14 Blue with my iPhone, as you can see here. I had to do the unlock feature. For example, when I get news feeds coming to my iPhone, what I do as you can see here, actually I typed the wrong word again. So this is the home screen where I use my braille or keyboard to navigate the dial pad of the iPhone. So I use Safari to access the World Wide Web. So apparently, I'm actually able to get the information real time. I actually took a 2-hour workshop. I could actually take a 2-hour workshop. Sorry.
Myself here. Yes, Bapin, I was wondering, do you prefer the Apple VoiceOver or JAWS technology? Which one is your preference?
That's a good question. Well, it's not an easy answer. I like what gives me the best access. JAWS works better for uses such as using computers, especially with Mac. So JAWS gives me best access with Mac. But when it's phone use, VoiceOver with the iPhone is really great because I use the phone for other purposes. So let's say I will just choose whatever gives me the best access for the need that I have at the moment. So again, I just try to use what gives me the best access for the purpose that I have at the time. So your preferences could be different. It's hard. I can't advise you definitely on one way or the other. It depends on what type of phone you have. If you have Samsung or some of the other types of phones, it really is an individual preference. If you remember before, I talked about the technology department at Helen Keller National Center being able to provide a lot of options for people to access technology in different ways. So it's really a person's individual decision, and they have to make an informed decision based on the needs that they have at the time.
Thank you very much. Hello there. My name is Gianni, and you know, today we have iPhones and iPads with touchscreen technologies. I'm wondering about any kinds of adaptive services technology that you have in order to be able to access those touchscreens, so that somehow perhaps instead of touching the screen and feeling nothing, instead you would feel braille.
Well, I actually just read an article about an engineer in India that's trying to come up with some type of phone that has the ability to have braille keys on it. Almost what we'd call braised. So I'm not sure if this will actually come to fruition, but it is coming now in a concept form. So there are a lot of exciting new types of technology that I think will be coming to the fore in the next 20 years. So the next generation, I think, will be even better off than we are. So we'll see what happens in these next 20 years. And I'll be hearing a lecture from you all on the technology 20 years from now.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone, and hello to you, Bapin. I do have a question for you. I've been hearing that some deafblind people really hate the computer. And the reason is because it makes them fatigued physically because of the way they have to read the braille. That very often reading it line by line can be physically fatiguing, and it's kind of turned them off to using the computers. Do you have any suggestions as to what might help individuals be better able to access things that are being read off the computer more conveniently? Well,
Art, you know, Each individual certainly has their own ways of setting up their technology to make it most comfortable for them. I know when I'm trying to set up my keyboard, I use a keyboard drawer to do that. And then I have my brailler on the other part of the desk. Some people prefer it the other way around, so that their brailler device is on the lower portion of the desk and the computer keyboard on the top, on that tray. So it really depends on how people do it. They may have to experiment. Also, they need to see how it would ergonomically feel for them when they set it up. They want to make sure that their body is not in a position that will cause that fatigue, especially if they have to work for quite some time on the computer. They want to be able to customize the settings to optimize their comfort. So what works for you might not work for me. So it's very important for deafblind individuals to be able to know themselves well enough to know how the equipment can best work for them. Some people want to lie down and read the news and have the brailler in bed at night right next to their bed so they can read it before they go to sleep. So for me, I might do this. So then as I'm ready to fall asleep, I can simply move my brailler off to the side and have a good night's sleep.
Thank you very much for that response. And I'll see you after this session's over. All right, Bapin? Hi, everyone. My name is Sherry, and I work in the area of technology here. And my question, though, has nothing to do with technology. I guess I'm just wondering, generally speaking, how do you, how do you get by when things happen, like, let's say, the power goes out? For example, when you were in that, typhoon and the hurricane, or during Hurricane Sandy in New York, what is it that you do in order to be able to kind of mitigate those natural disasters? Or
are you speaking of using the phone or using the computer or what?
Just in any sense.
Well, that is a good question. I always had a USB backup for my computer of about 6 hours and also an extra battery, so that in case of emergency, I would be able to, for example, buy another battery, a battery charger that would allow the battery to last even longer. However, oftentimes, let me see here. If you see here, this is a backup battery for my iPhone. If the battery I'm using currently dies, then I'm able to charge it and have a backup battery on hand. When you're flying in an airplane, there is no plug to charge your devices, so you need to have these battery backups. But if I'm going to be away from an electric plug a long time and I want to make sure I am able to communicate, I will definitely have these battery backups. Now, if there's an emergency that happens, I have to be able to access my technology. I'm just addicted to it. So I try to preserve the battery as much as I can in those types of situations.
I wanted to thank you for a wonderful presentation. I appreciate your being here at Gallaudet this afternoon, and we all very much enjoyed your remarks today. It's amazing to see where you've come from a very small rural town to where you are now in the United States. I mean, I can imagine you someday being president, sharing all of your experiences and how technology has changed your life in such an inspirational way. You are an inspiration to all of us, and we very much enjoyed your sharing your story with us today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Lisa. And
we do have a small gift we'd like to give you. This is a token of appreciation for you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
I also wanted to mention there is a reception right following this presentation out in the lobby of this room. So I'd ask that you all join us out there at the reception at the conclusion of this presentation. And thank you again very much, Bapin, for sharing your remarks.